This is The Shadow over San Marco, written by Beryl Coops.
The bells of the Palazzo Vecchio struck in the rain, each deep note rolling through the night like a warning. Florence had been restless all week, merchants muttering in their stalls, strangers lingering too long at the wine counters, and the sound of hoofbeats at odd hours. The rain that fell was soft like sifted ash, settling on the cobblestones and making the city glisten in dull silver. Matteo was hunched over the apothecary's workbench, sleeves rolled back, grinding dried hyssop for a tincture. Maestro Bernardi swore could soothe lungs blackened by smoke. The mortar was warm in his hands from the hours of work. The door to the workshop creaked open. It wasn't Bernardi returning from the back rooms. The silhouette was leaner, cloaked, and moved with a kind of careful purpose Matteo recognized instantly. "Carlo," he said, setting down the pestle, "you've come through the alley. That means trouble." Carlo pushed back his hood, rain sliding down his cheekbones. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his expression was all urgency. "Giuliano needs you at the townhouse," he said. "Now." Matteo frowned. "I'm in the middle of—" "It isn't a request." Matteo untied his apron and glanced at Bernardi's closed door. "He'll be furious if I leave without. He'll be more furious if Florence ends up at war." Carlo's voice was flat, but his eyes told Matteo this wasn't a jest. They moved quickly through the back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the watch still prowled despite the hour. The rain smelled faintly of smoke, a reminder of Savonarola's last bonfire in the Piazza della Signoria. Puddles reflected the faint flicker of torches in the distance. When they reached the Medici townhouse, Giuliano was waiting in the lamplight of a private study. He was not in court dress. He wore a dark doublet, the collar unfastened, his hair damp from pacing. "There's word from Venice," he said without preamble. "A treaty is being negotiated between the Republic and Florence. Trade routes, shared protections, the usual, but someone means to see it fail before the ink is dry." Matteo stood just inside the door. "Why me? I'm an apprentice apothecary, not a diplomat." Giuliano exchanged a look with Carlo. "Because," he said slowly, "you have a habit of overhearing things no one else can, and surviving long enough to tell me about them. Venice is a city of whispers, and I'll need more ears than Carlo's." "Venice," Matteo repeated, the word tasting of salt and distance. "I've never been." Carlo handed him a folded paper. "We leave at first light, by barge, down the Arno and into the sea. Pack light, and don't bring anything you're not prepared to lose." Matteo opened the paper, a travel pass signed and sealed by Giuliano himself. It was an open door into places he had no right to walk, and a promise that someone might want to see him dead for carrying it. He glanced back at Giuliano. "If this treaty fails, what happens?" Giuliano's jaw tightened. "The alliance with Venice collapses, trade falters, Florence bleeds coin, and Savonarola will be there to tell the people it is proof we are cursed." The rain had stopped by dawn, but a heavy mist clung to the river as they boarded the barge. Matteo stood at the stern beside Carlo, watching Florence fade into grey. Ahead lay 3 days on the water, the low creak of timber, and the steady pull of the current toward the sea. They passed fishing villages and watchtowers, the countryside rolling by in muted green. Carlo spoke little, his eyes scanning the banks as though expecting an ambush even here. Matteo used the hours to watch him, the way his hand never strayed far from the hilt of his dagger, the way he read the current before every bend in the river. On the second night they moored in a small inlet, the moon hidden by clouds. The boatman slept under a tarpaulin. Matteo and Carlo kept watch. It was then that Carlo told him what Giuliano had not. "The Venetian envoy who sent word, we think he's already in danger. His letters were intercepted once before. And Venice." Carlo gave a short laugh without humour. "Venice has a way of making men vanish without leaving so much as a ripple." Matteo's stomach tightened. "And we're walking into that?" "We're walking into it," Carlo said, "because if we don't, the Medici lose their footing, and the city falls to the preacher's wolves." When Venice finally rose out of the mist on the fourth morning, it was like a dream half remembered. The domes of San Marco glinted faintly in the pale sun, the canals dark and glassy beneath stone bridges. Gondolas slid like shadows between the palazzi, and the air smelled of brine, candle wax, and the faint metallic tang of wet iron. Matteo felt the weight of it settle on him. Florence had its dangers, alleys where knives waited, piazzas that could turn into mobs, but Venice was a city built to hide things, and they were here to drag something dangerous into the light. Venice rose out of the mist like a city deciding whether to reveal itself. The lagoon was flat as hammered pewter. Gulls wheeled and cried over low warehouses with green copper roofs and weathered wooden piles driven deep into the silt. The barge slid past the customs landing, oars whispering. No one shouted a welcome. Venice did not welcome, it assessed. "Keep your eyes soft," Carlo murmured. "Stare and they'll mark you as provincial. Pretend you've seen it all before." Matteo tried. He watched without appearing to, but the city stole his attention anyway. A palazzo's facade in pink Verona marble, its balconies like lace, a knot of gondolas at a traghetto landing, black hulls close as eels, a priest blessing fishermen from a leaning step. The barge nosed into a small private landing behind a tall house of pale Istrian stone. A servant in the Medici colours waited under the arch, his hands hidden in his sleeves, as if even his fingers might eavesdrop. He didn't introduce himself. "Sir Rinaldi is within," he said, already turning. "Quickly." Lodovico Rinaldi was Giuliano's envoy to Venice, thin as a quill and twice as sharp. He stood in a room whose 3 windows overlooked a narrow canal, each casement clouded with the breath of the damp. A map of the Adriatic lay on a trestle table under glass weights, its edges curled. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "You came quietly?" Rinaldi asked. "As quietly as a barge on a river," Carlo said. "What's changed since your last letter?" Rinaldi gestured to a chair but didn't sit himself, as if sitting required permission Venice had not granted. "The Doge is willing. Barbarigo wants the treaty, not love for Florence, but arithmetic. Trade makes saints out of misers. The problem is not in the Doge's chamber, it is in the corridors that lead there." "The Council of 10, Carlo said, "and those who whisper to them," Rinaldi replied. "I have reason to believe a faction means to make this treaty look like treason. If I present the terms and a knife turns up under the table, well," he spread his thin hands, "no treaty, and Florence sits in the stocks in the square of European opinion." Matteo had never met a man who sounded like a knife being sharpened. He had also never stood in a room that felt safer, while simultaneously feeling like a trap. He took the chair, because refusing it seemed like rudeness Venice would punish. "What do you want from us?" he asked. Rinaldi's eyes flicked to him at last, weighing him. "Carlo is known here. Useful, but known. You are not. You will go places a known man cannot go without raising the water. I will get you entry to the archive at San Marco. You will look for what does not belong." "Forged instructions?" Carlo asked. "Or genuine ones in a wrong hand?" Rinaldi said. "I've seen the tail of the eel. Find me the eel." The servant reappeared with travel permits, slips of vellum with wax and twined silk, the kind that made lesser men lower their eyes. Rinaldi handed Carlo a ring set with a simple red stone. "For doors that prefer rings to knocks," he said. They left through the rear gate and stepped straight into a narrow canal where a gondola was already bumping against a worn step. The gondolier wore a short cloak against the mist and the expression of a man who had decided long ago he would see everything and register nothing. "To San Marco," Carlo said. The gondola slipped into the watery street. Venice unrolled around them. Bridges like spines, grated windows like closed eyelids, lanterns reflecting as molten streaks on the black water. Somewhere a woman laughed. Somewhere a lute. Somewhere, always, the sound of water touching stone. A barca shot from a cross canal without warning. The impact came a half-breath later, a jolt that snapped Matteo's teeth together and threw him sideways. The gondola yawed. Carlo grabbed the gunwale and hauled Matteo upright as the prow grated along the barca's flank with a sting of splinters. Their gondolier hissed a curse and dug his oar hard, righting them with a wave that broke against the opposite wall. "Eyes, idiot!" The other boatman shouted, but his voice was wrong, punctual, too controlled for a genuine accident. He had the hood up too far, and when he shoved off, Matteo saw his prow had been blacked with soot all the way to the waterline. A disguise, not for beauty, but for the way lamplight holds onto clean wood. He had wanted to come unseen. "Did you see that?" Matteo said, pointing to the thick knot in the barca's bowline. 2 knots reefed together, then sealed with tallow. He prepared for collision. He meant to take us broadside. Carlo's mouth thinned, or to push us under the bridge. He looked up. The stone arch ahead was low, its underside scarred with old scrapes. An overturned gondola here would pin passengers like fish against a weir. Timing would have done the rest. Their gondolier spat into the water and resumed his steady stroke. No one shouted any more. The city absorbed the near death and re-smoothed the surface. Venice disliked fuss. At the landing near the Basilica, the air changed. Incense faint on the damp, hot wax, salt. Pigeons ascended like smoke as they crossed the square. The facade of San Marco lifted into the mist, a riot of mosaics and arches and gilded saints gazing down with an indifference carved by centuries. The procurator's offices along the south side sat shut-faced, their colonnades echoing with measured footsteps. "I have a friend in the scriptorium," Rinaldi had said. "He will meet you by the horses." The 4 bronze horses on the loggia watched everything and admitted nothing. Under them stood a man of middle years in a plain dark mantle with cuffs ink-stained enough to look like bruises. He inclined his head to Carlo and then to Matteo. "I am Brother Sebastiano," he said softly, Venetian by the shape of his vowels. "The Archivio is not for everyone. Today for you it is." Sebastiano produced a key like a small weapon and led them along a side passage where the Basilica's grandeur narrowed to a corridor lit by high slit windows. Dust lived here, and the papery rustle of old voices. The archive room was cooler than the church, lined with chests and armaria, each labelled in a tidy hand. Sebastiano moved as men move among sleeping animals, respectful without suddenness. "You will find records of communications between the procurators and resident envoys here," he said, unlocking a chest with a practiced twist. "Not every letter is filed. In Venice, that can mean a letter is important, or that it never existed. Both conditions are useful." He smiled, a crease of dry amusement. "Do not cough on anything priceless." Carlo positioned himself near the door, where he could see both corridor and window. Matteo rolled up his sleeves and leaned in. The first set of packets smelled of damp leather and glue, of iron gall ink, of years. He had learned to read hands quickly in Bernardi's shop. Prescriptions, recipes, notes scribbled by men convinced their own script was godly. The Venetian chancery hand was formal, squared letters, ascenders like tiny lances. A clerk wrote like this when he wanted to be remembered by his colleagues and ideally never identified by his enemies. "What does not belong?" Matteo murmured. In the second packet he felt it more than saw it, a change in rhythm, marginalia that had a different breath. He slid the sheet out carefully. The main letter was routine, a request for clarification on the weight of Florentine woolens to pass duty-free under the new proposal. But the margin bore a neat diagonal stroke, and beside it, a number. Not a page number, a prime number placed exactly 4 words in from the left, beside the 3rd line of the 2nd paragraph. In another letter in the same hand, another such mark, different prime, same position relative to the line, a 3rd letter, the same. "Someone's counting," Matteo said. Sebastiano looked up from a ledger. "Counting what? Words, or letters, or both?" Matteo laid the 3 sheets side by side. "If the number is a key, position along the line, then across lines, you could pull out a message, but only if you knew which letters were part of the set. At the bottom of one sheet, almost lost in the curve of the parchment, was a smudge that wasn't ink. He scraped a fingernail gently. Fine black powder came away. "Lamp black," he said. "From a shuttered lantern," Carlo added immediately, remembering the blackened prow of the barca. Sebastiano fetched a shallow tray and brushed the faint powder into it, then reached for a small vessel of clear oil. "If you wanted to hide a mark," he murmured, mixing quickly with a reed, "you might polish it into the parchment, but the oil will find it again." He painted the thinnest sheen across the lower margin. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, slowly, letters rose like drowned things rising to the surface, a tiny, almost invisible script, written where the page would meet a clerk's hand and the eye would not linger. "Not here. San Giuliano. 3 nights. Bells at Compline. Bring witness who cannot be bought." Carlo folded the letters back into their packets exactly as they had been. "We put nothing back out of place. If the eel feels the water change, he vanishes." They left the archive by a different corridor that opened into the Basilica proper. The church roared in golden shadow. Visitors from Ragusa and Milan murmured and craned their necks to the domes. Matteo's head felt light, the way it did after hours hunched over a bench, the world beyond the work too large, too bright. They crossed the square toward the procurati, moving among cloaked men and merchants in velvet caps, rings catching what little light there was. Pigeons scattered as a troop of halberdiers in the Doge's livery marched past, their halberd points slanting. At the colonnade's edge a gentleman stepped from the crowd, every part of him impeccably Venetian, black robe, white collar, measured smile. He inclined his head just enough to acknowledge that someone else existed, and no more. "Signor Carlo," he said in careful Tuscan. "Welcome back to our poor city. Doge Barbarigo sends his goodwill." Carlo's face did not change. "Alvise Contarini, your city looks far from poor." "The more splendid the dress, the more careful a man must be of stains," Contarini said. His eyes slid to Matteo and held there, not rudely, but long enough to tell him that in Venice, being unnoticed required skill he might not yet possess. "And this is?" "An assistant," Carlo said. "He listens well." "An underrated art." Contarini's gaze flicked to the ring on Carlo's hand, the red stone Rinaldi had given him. "Rinaldi chooses his trinkets shrewdly. You will inform him that the Doge hopes very much not to be embarrassed by any surprises that might make treaties difficult to sign." "If there are surprises," Carlo said evenly, "they won't be ours." "Of that I am certain," Contarini replied mildly. "Nevertheless, Venice has long arms and poor patience. Do keep to the shadows provided for you." He smiled like a man offering a favour. "And take care under bridges. The pilings are treacherous this year." He melted back into the crowd, two utterly forgettable men ghosting behind him. Matteo exhaled. "He knows about the gondola." "He knows about everything," Carlo said. "And he wants us to know he knows, so we wonder how much he knows. It's a Venetian pastime." They reached Rinaldi's house by a longer route. Rinaldi listened to the account standing at the window, his profile a line cut by a blade. "San Giuliano," he said when they finished. 3 nights. Carlo asked, "Your letters, are they pure?" "They pass through hands I do not control," Rinaldi said. "I write as if my enemy will read me. It spares me the tears of honest ink." Matteo laid out the prime number markings they'd found. "There will be more letters. Enough, and we can read the whole message, or enough of it to make someone flinch when we recite it." Rinaldi nodded. "Good, but assume the eel expects us now. The procurators hold a reception tomorrow night at the Cadoro. Everyone who wants to be someone will be there. So will some who can't afford to be known. Masks may not be required, but Venice wears them always." That night, fog rolled in from the lagoon, muffling the bells. Carlo insisted they walk, not ride. Gondolas made the wrong sound in such weather. They were passing under a low balcony when Matteo felt the change in the air, like the breath before a door opens. He yanked Carlo back an instant before something heavy crashed down where they would have been standing, a bundle of broken roof tiles packed into a net. Whoever held the rope jerked it back up, the net scraping the wall like a rat's claws. Carlo's knife was out before the echoes died, but a bolt slid inside the balcony door, and the sound of running feet faded into the boards overhead. "Someone is impatient," Carlo murmured. "Or wants us to give chase," Matteo said. "Exactly why we won't," Carlo replied, sheathing the blade. "We don't give this city the pleasure." They moved on, the fog swallowing their footsteps. The Cadoro rose from the canal like a palace sculpted from moonlight. By day its pale facade shone gold where the sun caught the tracery. By night, lanterns in coloured glass lit the water in streaks of crimson and emerald. Masks and cloaks streamed toward its marble steps, some by gondola, some on foot, their reflections shimmering in the black water. Matteo stood in the shadow of the landing arch, straightening the borrowed jacket Rinaldi had thrust at him. The cut was fine enough to pass in this company, but he felt like an impostor in every seam. Carlo adjusted the red-stoned ring on his hand, his voice low. "We are not here to drink the wine. We are here to see who spills it." They crossed the mosaic-floored atrium, past servants bearing trays of candied fruit and glasses of Malvasia. The air smelled of beeswax and expensive perfume. Music from a trio of lutes and viols threaded through the murmur of conversation, the sound echoing up to the painted ceiling where gold leaf gleamed in the candlelight. Rinaldi had been right. Everyone who wished to be seen was here, and half of those who did not. Procurators in velvet robes spoke in tight clusters. Foreign envoys from Milan and Ferrara lingered near the long windows. Merchants with too much gold in their teeth laughed a little too loudly at jokes about shipping rates. "Eyes open," Carlo murmured, "and don't get caught staring." Matteo tried to drift as if he belonged, letting the tide of bodies carry him through the room. His ears caught phrases: Doge's health, unsteady, Savonarola's sermons, dangerous talk, wool tariffs, ruinous. A mask of black satin paused beside him. The man beneath spoke without turning his head. "You are not one of ours." Matteo kept his voice even. "Venice has many hours." The mask gave a small, dry laugh. "True enough. Careful, stranger. This is a city where an extra ear can cost a man his tongue." Before Matteo could answer, the masked man moved away, melting into the press of silks and brocade. He found Carlo again near the central stair. "We're noticed," Matteo said quietly. Carlo didn't look surprised. "Good. Noticing us means they'll show themselves trying to see more. Now, upstairs." The upper gallery overlooked the main hall, a vantage point lined with arched windows open to the canal breeze. Here the crowd thinned. Quieter talk, fewer interruptions, more serious faces. Matteo leaned casually against the carved balustrade, scanning the guests below. That was when he saw it. Two masked figures standing apart in the far corner, half hidden behind a fluted column. One wore the white beak of a plague doctor, the other a simple domino mask. They spoke with the precise stillness of conspirators. The plague doctor handed over a slip of parchment no wider than a finger. The domino mask folded it into his palm without looking at it. Matteo shifted to catch their voices, the lute music below masking the movement of his feet. 3 nights, San Giuliano. The rest was swallowed by the noise. Then, witness already chosen, Matteo felt the prickle along his spine. San Giuliano, the same name as the hidden message in the archive. The domino mask slipped the folded parchment into his glove and glanced upward, scanning the gallery, a deliberate sweep that caught Matteo's eyes for the briefest fraction of a second. The look held no surprise, only acknowledgement. Carlo appeared at Matteo's side, following his gaze. "Which one?" "Domino mask," Matteo said. "He knows I saw him." "Then he'll change something," Carlo muttered. "We've shown a card too soon." Below, the domino mask began to move toward the side door leading to the private gondola landing. The plague doctor stayed where he was, speaking to a merchant in a green robe as if nothing had happened. "Go after him," Carlo said. "I'll keep eyes here." Matteo hesitated. "Alone?" Carlo's mouth tightened. "You're the unknown face. He'll let you closer than me." Matteo's pulse hammered as he descended the far stair, blending into a group of guests headed toward the same side of the hall. The domino mask was already at the landing arch, speaking to a gondolier in low tones. The man stepped into his boat and the gondola pushed off, gliding into the dark canal. Matteo moved to the edge, scanning the water, committing the silhouette and direction to memory. When he turned back toward the hall, the music had faltered. Voices had sharpened, and from somewhere above he heard the unmistakable crash of glass. The crash of glass was followed by a woman's sharp cry. The music stumbled to a halt, the final lute chord hanging in the air like a question. Matteo moved quickly back toward the main hall. The crowd was shifting, not scattering, not yet, but craning necks toward the source of the disturbance. On the upper gallery, guests pressed toward the balustrade. Carlo was there, his posture tight. When Matteo joined him, he saw why. Beneath the great central chandelier, a man lay sprawled on the mosaic floor. His mask, half black velvet, half gold leaf, had been torn away, revealing eyes wide open, unblinking. Blood seeped from the corner of his mouth in a thin, dark ribbon. Servants hesitated at the edges of the circle forming around the body. No one knelt to help. No one in Venice touched the dead before certain questions were asked. Carlo's voice was low. "That's Marco di Salviati, Florentine merchant, loyal to the Medici." "Then this is no accident," Matteo said. "Not with half the council of 10 in the room," Carlo murmured. A procurator in crimson robes stepped forward, his voice ringing off the marble. "The evening is over. All guests will remain until they have spoken to the watch." This was met with polite outrage, but no one moved for the doors. The watchmen were already there, 2 at each exit, halberds crossed. Carlo nodded toward a side corridor. Move. Now. They slipped away from the main hall and into a narrow gallery lined with painted panels. The noise of the crowd faded behind them, replaced by the faint slap of water against the building's foundations. "Why leave?" Matteo asked. "Wouldn't staying make us seem less suspicious?" Carlo's mouth curved in a humourless smile. "We're already suspicious. Best to find out why before someone else decides the answer for us." They crossed a small loggia overlooking the canal, the cold air briny and damp. A gondola passed below, its passenger hidden by the low roof, but Matteo recognized the profile, the domino mask, still in place, glancing upward just long enough to see them watching. Then the gondola vanished under the bridge. Carlo swore softly. He didn't just leave early, he left right after the killing. "And San Giuliano is in 3 nights," Matteo said. Carlo's eyes narrowed. "Which means we may not have 3 nights." They left the Cardoro by the servants' entrance, stepping into the maze of alleyways that laced the Cannaregio district. The fog thickened here, swallowing the light of the street lamps. Footsteps echoed in ways Matteo couldn't place. Too far, then suddenly too near. A shape moved in the mist ahead. Carlo's hand went to his dagger. "Stay behind me." The figure didn't advance, it simply stood there, watching. Then, without a word, it turned and melted into the fog. Matteo felt the tension in his gut like a drawn bowstring. Was that an invitation? Carlo exhaled slowly. No, that was a warning. They didn't speak again until the door of Rinaldi's house closed behind them. Morning in Venice did not break so much as seep in, pale light diffusing through the fog, turning the city into a half-finished sketch. Matteo sat at the long wooden table in Rinaldi's dining hall, staring into a cup of coffee so bitter it felt like penance. He'd barely slept, his head still full of the music cut short, the man on the floor, and the mask that had looked back at them from the gondola. Across from him, Carlo leaned against the wall, arms folded, expression unreadable. Rinaldi had not yet emerged from his private rooms. That was never a good sign. When he did, he moved with the precise, deliberate steps of a man who understood how easily a city could burn. "The procurators are calling it a tragedy," he said, voice flat. "An unexpected death in the midst of celebration." Matteo frowned. "They're calling it an accident?" "They'll call it whatever keeps the peace," Rinaldi replied. "Venice survives on the illusion that nothing is ever truly wrong here." Carlo's jaw tightened. Salviati's death was no accident, and the man who left in that gondola— "I know who you mean," Rinaldi cut in. "A merchant from Dalmatia, trades in glass and spice. His name is Niccolo Cervenka. On paper, he is nothing. In truth—" He glanced toward the shuttered windows. "He is a hand that moves for those who prefer to stay in shadow." Matteo shifted in his seat. "Then why let him go?" "Because," Rinaldi said, "the Council of 10 plays a long game. They would rather follow him, see where he leads." Carlo looked at Matteo, then back at Rinaldi. "We don't have that luxury. Every hour he's free is another chance for this treaty to die before it's signed." They left Rinaldi's house by water. Carlo had hired a gondolier he trusted, a man with a scar across his cheek and the kind of silence that meant he'd seen worse than most could imagine. The air was heavier now, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the crumbling facades and shuttered windows of the merchant quarter. Every sound, the oar dipping into the water, the creak of the hull, carried far in the stillness. Matteo scanned the edges of the canals, eyes tracing every balcony and narrow quay. Somewhere in this maze, Niccolo Cervenka was hiding, or preparing to move again. "Where would a man like that go?" Matteo asked quietly. Carlo didn't hesitate. Somewhere noisy enough to disappear, but private enough to close a deal. He glanced toward the distant curve of the Grand Canal. The glassmaker's quarter, Murano. Matteo felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "And you think he'll still be there?" "I think," Carlo said, "that men like him always return to the fire." The gondola skimmed across the lagoon, the water churning in long silver wakes behind them. Murano rose ahead, its cluster of low buildings wrapped in a haze of smoke. Even from here, Matteo could feel the heat rolling off the island, the breath of the furnaces that had burned for centuries. They tied up at a small landing, the gondolier melting back into the fog with a promise to wait. Carlo motioned for Matteo to keep close, then set off down a narrow lane where molten light spilled from open workshop doors. The glassmaker's quarter was alive with noise. The deep whoosh of bellows, the ringing clink of metal tools, and the strange muffled roar of the kilns. Men in scorched leather aprons moved with practiced rhythm, turning molten glass on long iron pipes, the glowing shapes swelling and spinning before being dipped in water with a hiss. Carlo stopped at the threshold of one workshop, his gaze fixed on a man at the far end, speaking low to a tall figure in a dark coat. Matteo's breath caught. The coat was the same cut as the gondola passengers. Cervenka. "Stay here!" Matteo ignored him, edging forward just far enough to see more. The glassblower glanced up, a large man with arms like bundled rope. He said something to Cervenka, who nodded once, then moved toward a side door. Carlo stepped inside. "Niccolo Cervenka." His voice was calm, but it carried like a blade drawn in the dark. The tall man froze, then turned. His face was long, his smile deliberate. "And you are?" "Someone who doesn't have time for games." Cervenka tilted his head toward the glassblower. "Now." The big man moved with shocking speed. He swung the iron pipe like a quarterstaff, the hot end still glowing red. Carlo ducked, the pipe whistling past his head and slamming into the doorframe hard enough to splinter wood. Matteo's heart lurched. He grabbed the nearest thing, a long wooden paddle used for cooling glass, and shoved it between the glassblower's legs. The man stumbled, but didn't fall, roaring as he swung again. Carlo closed in, steel flashing in the furnace light. He caught the pipe with one hand, slashed the man's forearm with the other. The glassblower howled, dropping the weapon, but Cervenka was already gone, the side door banging shut. "Move!" Carlo barked. They burst into the alley, just in time to see the dark coat vanish into the fog. Matteo ran harder than he thought possible, dodging hanging laundry crates and sudden drops where the canal lapped at the stone. Cervenka took a sharp turn into a dead-end quay. Matteo almost didn't believe their luck, until he saw the gondola waiting there. The oarsman shoved off, the boat sliding into the channel with terrifying speed. Carlo cursed, skidding to a stop. Matteo looked around desperately. Across the canal, a narrow bridge arched over the water. "That way!" he shouted, already sprinting. They pounded across the bridge, the oarsman glancing up in surprise as Carlo's shadow fell across the bow. The gap was too wide to jump, until Matteo spotted a stack of timber at the far end. He scrambled up and shoved one of the planks outward. It crashed across the gap, just enough for Carlo to run it, leaping down into the gondola. Steel met steel in a flurry of motion. By the time Matteo caught up, Cervenka was gone over the side, vanishing beneath the oily ripples. Carlo stood in the rocking boat, chest heaving. "He's not dead," he said. "Men like him always resurface." Matteo swallowed hard, watching the ripples fade. "Then we'd better be ready when he does." By the time they returned to Venice proper, the lagoon was a shifting mirror of moonlight and shadow. The gondola slipped silently into the dark veins of the city, the great domes and campaniles of the Piazza San Marco looming ahead. It was well past midnight, yet the square was not empty. Lanterns burned in the arcades, casting their light over the paving stones. A cluster of men in merchant silk spoke in tight, urgent circles. Above them, the great Basilica brooded in silence, its gilded mosaics catching stray glints from the torches. Carlo guided Matteo along the darker edge of the piazza. "The treaty signing is in the morning," he murmured. "If Cervenka means to stop it, this is where it will happen." Matteo scanned the shadows under the arches. "You think he's here already?" "I think he never left." They slipped through a side entrance into the basilica, the door groaning shut behind them. At once the air cooled, the thick scent of incense mingling with cold marble and dust. Moonlight spilled through the upper windows, catching the gold leaf in the mosaic so they shimmered like frozen fire. The cavernous silence pressed against Matteo's ears. Every step they took seemed too loud, the echo threatening to give them away. Carlo stopped, his gaze tracking the darkness near the high altar. There. At first, Matteo saw nothing. Then a figure stepped from behind a column, and another followed. Both wore masks of dark lacquer, the kind favoured at masquerades, though the hour and the place made the sight all the more unsettling. Between them, they carried a chest, no larger than a travelling case. "They're not here to pray," Matteo whispered. Carlo's hand brushed the hilt of his knife. "Stay behind me." The masked men moved toward a side chapel, their boots ringing softly on the stone. Carlo padded after them, Matteo close behind, the torchlight from the piazza barely reaching this far. They turned a corner and walked straight into a third masked figure. Steel flashed. Carlo met the strike with his forearm, the blade cutting a thin line through his sleeve. He shoved the attacker back, but the man recovered quickly, lunging again. Matteo grabbed a candlestick from a nearby stand, swinging it clumsily but hard enough to send the mask skidding sideways. The man snarled, his cheekbones split and bleeding, before bolting into the shadows. The sound drew the other two. They abandoned the chest and came forward with purpose, blades out. Carlo ducked under the first strike, slashing low, his knife catching the man across the thigh. Matteo rammed the candlestick into the second man's gut. He folded, but not before his blade caught Matteo's shoulder in a shallow, burning line. The chest lay abandoned in the middle of the chapel floor. "Open it," Carlo snapped. Matteo knelt, fumbling with the clasp. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He peeled it back, revealing not jewels or coin, but scrolls, each bearing the seal of the Venetian Senate. "Treaty drafts," Carlo said grimly. "If these disappear, the signing collapses. War becomes inevitable." Matteo's head whipped toward the altar. "Then where's Cervenka?" A slow clap echoed through the basilica. From the shadows behind the pulpit, Cervenka emerged, his coat immaculate, his smile unreadable. "Impressive," he said. "I expected you to be chasing ghosts on Murano until morning." Carlo stepped forward, knife ready. "You're finished." Cervenka's gaze flicked to the treaty scrolls. "On the contrary, I've already done what I came to do." Matteo frowned, and then he saw it. A small ceramic sphere on the pulpit steps, the kind used by glassmakers to hold volatile chemicals. A thin trail of smoke leaked from the fuse. Carlo was already moving. He kicked the sphere hard, sending it skittering across the marble until it bounced harmlessly into a shallow basin of holy water. The hiss was immediate, the smoke snuffed out. When Matteo looked back, Cervenka was gone. They gave chase through the basilica's rear corridors, the echo of boots ricocheting off the vaulted ceilings. The passage opened onto the arcade, moonlight spilling through the arches. Cervenka was halfway across the piazza when Carlo burst out after him, Matteo only steps behind. The chase carried them past shuttered cafes and silent statues, their shadows stretching long over the stones. At the far end, a gondola waited. Cervenka leapt in, shoving the oarsman aside. Carlo didn't slow. He vaulted onto the prow, the boat lurching dangerously. The two men crashed together, the canal slapping at the hull. Matteo reached the edge, grabbing the rope to haul the boat back in. Carlo had Cervenka pinned, the knife at his throat. "Do you know what you've cost your masters tonight?" Carlo asked, his voice low and tight. Cervenka's smile didn't falter. "They will simply try again. Venice is a city of 1,000 doors, and you can't guard them all." Carlo's jaw tightened. Then, instead of striking, he shoved Cervenka backward into the canal. The man vanished beneath the dark water, the ripples carrying him into the night. They stood there a moment, breathing hard, the sounds of the sleeping city returning around them. Matteo looked toward the basilica, where the moonlight glinted on the great domes. "Will he be back?" "Yes," Carlo said. "Men like him always resurface."
This was The Shadow over San Marco, written by Beryl Goops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Goops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.